Roger. But I'm very glad to have Jeannie. I've known Jeannie for a long time, and this is a really important topic. And I have a feeling I know some of the things she's going to say. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wong, who's going to do a more formal introduction of Jeannie.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Roger Wong. I think I'm in RCMAR cohort number 3 or 4. I'm pretty sure I'm number 3 though. I'm assistant professor of public health and preventive medicine at SUNY Upstate Medical University. That's in Syracuse, New York. And it's my pleasure to moderate today's professional development series. The title of today's talk is How to Work with a Statistician. We are joined by our guest today, Dr. Jeannie-Marie Leoutsakos. She is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the director of the department's Biostatistics and Methodology Core. She works with a wide variety of researchers, primarily in the field of dementia, and her research primarily involves the use of latent variable methods, such as latent class analysis and growth mixture models, to identify groups of people on the basis of patterns of symptoms or patterns of trajectories over time.
So, thank you.
Yes, and for those of you that didn't hear the first few minutes of today's, what we were chatting about, we are allowing kind of like open Q&A if you want to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm happy to moderate some of the questions at the end. And full disclosure, I'm one of the core statistician consultants at my university, so my apologies if I'm a little selfish and have many questions for you, Dr. Leoutsakos.
Well, you may have corrections for me, right? So,
I do a terrible job at explaining to people how they should best communicate and work with me. So I'm very interested in today's talk. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So here's my outline. It's what I'm going to talk about. Some of it is Hopkins centric, and I apologize for that, but I think most of it is fairly universal, and even universal with regard to extending beyond working with a statistician and maybe working with other types of researchers that you would encounter working on a project, because everything is multidisciplinary now. So I'm going to talk about what I do, how I get involved in various projects. I'm going to make a case for early involvement. So why you should get a statistician on your team when you start your project, not when you finish it. I'm going to talk about various roles that statisticians play in projects, compensation, how to negotiate the relationship, researchers' responsibilities, statisticians' responsibilities, how to find a statistician. And then also, if there's a bit of time at the end, I'll also tell you what I tell statisticians. So I actually have another version of this talk, but it's the other way around. It's like how to talk to non-statisticians. And I'll tell you what I tell statisticians if there's time. All right, so what do I do? A big part of what I do is study planning, and actually probably the most important contribution that I make to projects is helping researchers craft testable hypotheses. If you don't have a testable hypothesis, then you don't have science, essentially. And also design of experiments. I help with grant writing, primarily the analytics section of grants, but I also read and provide feedback on the entire grant. Some statisticians also will assist with database design and maintenance. I don't do that so much, which is why I put that in italics, but some statisticians do. Data analysis, direction or action, preparation of manuscripts and presentations. Statisticians who are faculty members will likely spend a significant portion of time teaching and or doing their own methodological research as well. So this is how we spend our time, essentially. So the case for early involvement is no surprises, right? Surprises are not good in science generally. like I mentioned before, one of the things that a statistician can help you with is in framing a testable hypothesis. I'm just going to need to move this because I've got the window blocking part of my slide here. Okay. All right. A statistician can also help you avoid potential biases in study design. For certain kinds of, for example, clinical trials, they can help you with stopping rules. They can tell you what data you need and how to collect and format and store that data so that when you get to the end of your project, you're actually able to test the hypothesis that you wanted to test. They can help you with figuring out what sample size you need. There's also some accountability, right? If you bring a statistician in at the very end, after the study is done and all the data are collected, that person's going to be less invested, right? Because they weren't involved in the design. The con section of this slide is much thinner, right? There's very few. Essentially, it's just time and expense. You probably will need to compensate them in some way for the time that they spend doing this other work for you, but it's important work. It has happened a couple of times where people have come to me at the very end and I've had to tell them that they did not have the data that they needed to test the hypothesis that they had intended. And that's always very unhappy news to deliver. So compensation. Sometimes these conversations are a little bit awkward, right? Biostatistical faculty, and by that I mean faculty members who have primary appointments in departments of biostatistics or departments of statistics, or might even be a math department at a smaller university. Those faculty are promoted largely on the basis of their contributions to biostatistics, which it shouldn't be a surprise really, but what that means practically speaking is that that's where their attention is going to be focused. They're going to be interested in writing methodological papers, right? And they will do applied work, but it may not be their focus, and something to keep in mind. Typically speaking, you will either pay fees. For example, here at Hopkins, if you have the Biostatistics Consulting Center working on your grant, then they have a fee schedule, or you may pay a percentage of someone's salary. It's usually something like 10 or 15% for like an R01. The other ways that faculty might be compensated are via supplies, or you may pay a portion of someone who works for them, like a data analyst or a research assistant. Also, authorship, particularly on methods slanted papers and acknowledgements on papers and talks. Statisticians should be included as authors on papers if it's appropriate, and there is actually guidelines on this, and you can take a look at them here. If you are working with a statistician in a way that would be optimal, almost certainly it would be appropriate for them to be an author on the paper, because they will have met these criteria. They will have made a substantial contribution, at least to Part B and possibly to Part A of Section A. You will want them to look at the manuscript and edit it, and so on. This thing down at the bottom here, this point that I have, accepting payment does not waive one's right to authorship. This is a little odd thing that I've heard people say a couple of times, not lately though, I'm glad to say, but like, well, you can't be an author on the paper because we're paying you. And that does not make sense, and it's not correct. And so I just wanted to mention that. Roger, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I have a question that's kind of
Please.
tied to this slide and also the previous slide on compensation. So I guess for you talked on the previous slide that for compensation, like for sometimes for like grant projects, you charge typically around like 10 to 15%. So those are like, I would guess, more like long-term projects. I'm
That's
wondering,
right.
What about like shorter term projects? Like how is your approach to that? Like, I guess you do more of like an hourly sort of thing. And then my specific question for that, yeah. So I
Yeah,
have,
so I don't have, so I'm not a cost center at Hopkins. So like the consulting center, for example, so I don't even have a mechanism to charge people by the hour. And I actually end up doing a lot of that sort of work for free for people. Although probably I shouldn't, but that's just how it ends up happening. But there are other entities at Hopkins and at other institutions where you would pay by the hour. And so you would sit down with them and they would come up with an estimate. Well, we think this is going to be 20 hours or whatever. But it might get revised too. And that's how that would play out. But I personally actually am only ever, it's either free or effort, which is probably not great for me, but that's how it ends up playing out.
gotcha. Thank you so much.
So just a few caveats about authorship though. So I said, yes, you should include statisticians on papers, generally speaking, right? That said, you do need to get people's permission for that, and even for acknowledgements. And typically, you will want them to have reviewed the paper. Another thing that I would mention is that when you use somebody's name and you thank them, which is an appropriate thing to do, it does imply endorsement in a sense, right? And so let's say, and this happens, right? People will ask me my opinion on how they should do a certain analysis, and sometimes they don't take that advice, which is okay, right? But they might still want to thank me for their time, but you probably want to make that point that they were thanking me for the time or for the discussion instead of sort of implying endorsement of what had happened. You also, when you do this though, you want to give people adequate time. So probably 1 to 2 weeks to review. So sometimes people will send papers and they'll say, but I have to send it tomorrow. And that isn't really a fair thing to do because I would not necessarily have time to actually review it and make sure that I was okay with it, right? Now, if someone waives acknowledgement or authorship, you should probably find out why, right? Because it could be a red flag. It might mean that there's something in the manuscript that they're uncomfortable with. And that's worth knowing what it is, right? It might be something you want to change. It might not be, but it's something to think about. Now, the relationship that you have with a statistician, and actually this is the part really that's true of any relationship you have with any other researcher, because all research is multidisciplinary now. There is going to have to be a negotiation, right? There's no way to avoid this. And doing this badly or not at all can lead to problems, right? And so what you want to do when you sort of approach somebody to work on a project is to be very frank about expectations, roles, compensation, authorship, timetables, deadlines. So you would go have a meeting, or in this day and age, it probably would be via Zoom. But then after that meeting, then also put it in writing. It was very nice to meet you today. We discussed this project. I'm going to do this. You're going to do this. I'm going to draft a paper and be first author. You're going to do this analysis. This is when that's going to happen, and so on. You want to ask about policies, how and when they can be contacted, and so on. And a particular statistician might not be a good fit. Now, this needs to occur at the first meeting, at the outset. There are a lot of situations where I didn't ask questions that I should have at the outset and assume things that were not the same as what the other person was assuming, right? And that can lead to misunderstandings. Another point I wanted to make is that sometimes long-term projects will change hands. For example, an investigator leaves the institution and another person takes over as PI of that project. If that happens, you need to have that conversation again. Sometimes I've made the mistake of assuming that whatever arrangement I had negotiated with the previous PI would carry through, and that if the current PI does not know about that conversation or doesn't want to have that same agreement, then that's going to lead to a problem. So it's just something to think about. And the other thing I would say is that, you know, sometimes these conversations feel a little bit awkward, but it's going to be considerably more awkward later on, potentially, if you don't have that conversation. So that's the thing to sort of spur you forward, to open that conversation. So I have two sets of slides coming. The first one is going to be sort of a researcher's responsibilities, and then there's going to be sort of a mirror slide that is a statistician's responsibility. So researcher's responsibility, sort of frank negotiation of the relationship, right? It can be very awkward to be like, how much money do you want? But you just have to do it. The researcher is going to be responsible for substantive teaching. And by that, I mean explaining the subject matter. It may or may not be something the statistician knows anything about. And so they're going to be teaching the substance, like, for example, the medicine. And they're going to be learning the methods, right, from the statistician. Setting and meeting deadlines is really important. A lot of times the statistician is at the end of a long chain, right? And so if everybody in that chain's a day late, then that means, but the final deadline is hard, then that means that I get squeezed at the end the most, right? And so it ends up having a lot of downstream consequences. Another responsibility is compensation, including attribution, provision of accurate data, right? You're going to need to answer probably a lot of questions about the study design. You're going to need to provide a code book with the data. Sometimes code book is called a data dictionary. And then you're going to need to accurately report the results, right? I wanted to talk a little bit more about data documentation. This is boring, but incredibly, incredibly important. Data documentation includes study protocol, data operations manual, a statistical analysis plan, the code book or data dictionary. Ideally, this is going to be electronic and searchable, right? So if you give somebody a paper data dictionary that's 500 pages long, then if I need to find out what a particular variable is, I've got to read through that 500 pages. A sample CRF, that's a case report form. So if this is a clinical trial, you're going to have, for example, a binder that has all the scales that you administer to patients, for example. You're going to need to have a documentation of any unresolved queries. What are the invalid values? For example, if I'm doing analyses that involve, let's say, lab values, let's say bilirubin, I'm just making this up. Most of the research I do is in psychiatry. So I don't know about bilirubin. It has something to do with your liver. That's what I know about bilirubin. So I don't know if a value is a normal value or a value that could not possibly have been in nature and must be an error. I don't know. That's the information that you want to provide to me. And also version control of your data set. So is this the most recent version of the data? No, this is version 2, and it differs from version 1 and version 3 in the following ways. All of that needs to be tracked, right? And actually here I have a reference for a paper that actually describes in more detail how to share data for collaboration, right? Jeff Leake is actually in the Department of Biostatistics here at Hopkins. A little bit more about code books, right? This is really important for statisticians. They can be really elaborate or really simple. You want to have variable names, ideally variable names that make sense. For each variable, you're going to need a description. What is that variable? The format. For example, for dates, be careful and explicit, right? Is it day, month, year, or month, day, year? Encoding for values, right? If you have a variable that's sex, You need to say what's a 0, what's a 1. What are the ranges, acceptable values, missing data codes, right? Doing this well can save you a lot of time and money on the back end. A statistician can help you set this up, and REDCap actually will make one for you automatically. Questions about this? So I will say a very nice organized code book is a way to keep your statistician happy. So if you send your statistician an email that says, and this is a true story, hey, I'm sorry, I only have a partial code book and it's in French. Is that okay? No, that's not okay. For example. All right, questions about that, actually, about the code book?
How do you usually like to get the code book, in like a Word document form or like a Excel? Does it matter?
It does matter. Electronic is better than non-electronic. I'll say that to start, right? Because you can search it. Word might be okay as long as I can search it, right? So if it's if sometimes people will send me PDFs that they've just PDF'd a paper code book, in which case I won't be able to search it. So the main thing is that I could search it, like I can do Control F and look for something. Excel is nice often, so Excel might be better than Word if it's if I can look for, if it's tabulated such that I can look up coding and stuff like that. But Word might be okay as long as things are organized in tables and I can search it. Yeah. So I had this slide that was the researcher's responsibilities, and so
I did
please.
see George unmuted for a second.
Yeah, Roger, I just had a question, Jeannie. When you're working with large longitudinal data sets and, where the variable naming conventions may have changed and the variables themselves may be operationalized differently depending upon the time of measurement, do you have any advice there in terms of, code books for these long, running studies where, sometimes it's very complicated to go back and figure out what was done 20 years ago?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm having, when you say that, I have in mind like the ECA, for example, right? Maybe that's what you had in mind as well.
Well, I thought of that, but other studies too. I mean,
yeah,
it's kind of a general problem with these studies.
So best case scenario is that you have a naming convention from the outset, right? So if you had, Q1 V2, Q1 V3, which would be question 1 at visit 2 and question, right? The best thing is to have a systematic, well-explained naming convention. If you don't, then what you need to have is documentation that maps it to something that is convention, that does make sense, right? So you'd need to have to say question 3 at visit 3 has this variable name. Question 3 at visit 4 has this variable name, right? It's going to have to be mapped out in some way. And what all this does, even if it takes, so there's two things, right? If it's so confusing that it's unintelligible, then your statistician's going to make mistakes, right? But even if let's say it's not that bad, if the longer it takes for the statistician to figure it out, if you're paying them by the hour, or if you're waiting and you want your results, this is actually the thing that slows things down the most, is just figuring out what the variables are, right? And so if you want to save yourself like time and money, put the time into this, right? So ECA, for example, you want also variable names that make sense, right? So in the ECA, this is an example. There's a set of variables called the train variables, right? I don't know if you remember that or not, but so what does that mean, right? Does it mean like training variables? What does it mean? It turns out they're called, that set of variables is called the train variables because Bill Eaton was on a train when he was thinking about those variables. And I love Bill Eaton, but like that's an example of how not to name variables, right? Because it relies on having that piece of information, which you would not have, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. I think that's, it's a problem that we run into again and again with these big longitudinal studies. And I think anything we can do to make it easier for the statistician should be done.
Yeah, you have to provide that map.
Yeah,
Essentially. So like there is that slide that has responsibilities for researchers, there's sort of the mirror slide for the statistician. So again, is that frank negotiation of the relationship, confidentiality, right? I don't talk to anybody about what's in somebody's data set or what's going on with their study or what happened during their DSMB meeting. I'm like a priest, right? It's like that, right? So I don't share data, I don't share reviews, I don't tell people what was in your pink sheets, whatever, right? In the same way that the researcher is responsible for substantive teaching and methodological learning, for me, it's flipped, right? I need to teach researchers about the methods that I'm using, right? And I am responsible for learning about the substance. And I like to do this. And you should look for a statistician who likes to do this. So if I worked on a hip fracture study, I went on YouTube and I watched a hip fracture surgery. Boy, was that eye-opening, right? For example, or actually back in December, I spent a morning in the psychiatric ER at Hopkins because I was working on a data set that had to do with what factors predict whether you are involuntarily admitted, right? And so I went there and I spent the morning there, right? And I watched an admission. And that's really important because I can't do analyses. I can't make decisions about how to analyze the data unless I understand how that data were collected and what those things mean. It's my responsibility to explain things very carefully, why I made certain choices, what this analysis means, because you as a researcher, you're gonna have to get up and give a talk and present this stuff, and you need to know and agree with the decisions I've made, right? I need to set and meet deadlines. I need to provide documentation, just like researchers have to provide documentation to me about the data. I had to provide documentation about the analyses that I've done. And it really should be at the level such that someone else could replicate the results. And I need to accurately report those results. Questions about this? These are all things that you should expect from your statistician. And you're, within your rights to require them. Right. So in terms of that documentation, it needs to be very specific. Like I used equation 3 on page 417 of thus and such article, right? It can't be something very vague, like in SAS, there's a command called procmix. It can't be like, I used procmix. You say that, you can't replicate the analysis, right? So I need to say what software I used, what version. I need to provide log files, computed code, and so on. If I don't provide that documentation, it wastes time because suppose something happens, another statistician takes over that project, how are they going to figure out what I did, right? If I don't have that documentation. Also, this has never actually happened, but I keep it in mind because it could happen. But suppose, God forbid, you're ever accused of having done something unethical in your analysis. How would you counter that? How would you respond if you had no details about how the analyses were done, right? And here's a link to a website actually that has resources for how to make research reproducible. And in general, I've seen over like the past decade or so a push towards reproducible research for sharing of data and sharing for computing code. And I think in the future, we're going to see more of that. I think within 10 years, you're not going to be able to submit a paper anywhere without also submitting your computing code. I think that's what's coming in the future. Questions about this? So why does it take so long? So this is true, any statistician I know, people are always asking me when are they going to get their results. So why does it take so long? So if you think about it, statisticians always have their hands in a lot of things. At any given time, they're going to be on 10 or 20 different projects. I actually could not even tell you how many things I'm actively involved in currently. I purposely don't sit down and make that list because it would just freak me out if I did. But if you could do the math this way, so let's say I'm on grants for 5%, well, then I've got to be on 20 grants, right? And that doesn't count the stuff I do on the side for free, right? And so there's also grant preparation that I'm doing that's not funded, side projects, whatever, right? So you think about it, I've got 20 bosses at any time, right? Many departments don't invest in infrastructure, right? Another thing that affects the workflow is that, let's say I've got 20 projects going at any given time. If the most efficient way for me to operate is to do an analysis, finish it, send it off, then move on to the next analysis. If on a given day, if I'm doing analyses like in dribs and drabs for each principal investigator, then every time I go into the data set, I have to remember what the variables are, what's going on. I have to be like, oh, right, this is the one with the monkeys or whatever. It's inefficient because I have to get back into that mode of that study and remembering what the structure of the data was and how the experiment was run and so on every time I go back in. So the fewer times I go back in, the better, right? So that's a way to be more efficient. Another thing just to mention is that people often wildly over or underestimate how long certain things take, right? So there are some things that people think are going to take a long time that I can actually do with one line of code, but the converse is also true, right? Now, and doing things in a way that's careful and that's documented, right, takes longer than just doing it, right? And rushing leads to errors, right? So a lot of times it's actually in the long run more efficient and less time to do something right one time correctly rather than rushing and then you have to keep going back and fixing it, right? And I mentioned this before, but you really can't mention it enough times. The single biggest determinant of how long something takes is the quality of the data I receive. And by quality, I mean how is it formatted? Do I have to do a lot of cleaning? Is it very clear what the variables are, and so forth? There's something I'm working on right now. I just finished it, actually. It took me 3 weeks to get the data to where I could do the analysis I needed to do, and the analysis took me 2 hours. So just imagine if they'd sent the data to me in a way that was easier for me, then they would have got, well, they wouldn't have gotten back in 2 hours, but they would have gotten it back a lot faster, right? So that's something to keep in mind. This is just something that's funny, so I just wanted to show it to you, right? Reviewer 3. I don't know why it's always reviewer 3, but it does seem like it is. Questions so far?
For the last slide on the timing, what is do you have any general, I guess, guidelines on like how much time to allow the statistician depending on the effort on the project?
Well, so the effort should be a measure of how much time you imagine, right? So 10% would be a half a day a week, right? Presumably. Personally, I'm not good at estimating how long things will take. I sort of thought I would get better over time, but I've been doing this a long time and I'm not better at it. So what I've started to do is instead of telling people you're going to get your results on Tuesday, I tell people where they are in the queue, right? And part of this is that a lot of times I don't know how long something's going to take until I get the data, because if it's a mess, then it's going to take longer, but I don't know ahead of time.
Gotcha.
So, I mean, I actually don't have a great, I think most, like an R01, a big like clinical trial, I think should probably be at least 10%. And actually, I'll tell you lately, I've been upping the percentage that I tell people. Like I used to tell people, oh, okay, I'll do it for 5%. I don't do that anymore, actually, because I usually lowball what I tell people. And then what that just means is that I end up, you know, everybody ends up waiting for their stuff longer, right? Because I end up overcommitted.
Yeah, I'm in the same situation. I'm 10% for an R01 as a statistician. I don't know what to tell the PI. I'm like, it's just whenever I finish it.
Well, right, but that's not a very satisfying answer, right? to them, for sure. All right, so how do you find a statistician? This slide is very Hopkins centric, but there is a biostatistics consulting center that's run by faculty in the Department of Biostatistics at the School of Public Health. There's the BEAD Corps. This is at Bayview. They will offer any Bayview faculty 20 free hours of work, and then anything after that you have to pay for. There's the GCRC. PBMC is my group. It's in psychiatry. And also the other way that people find stats is just word of mouth, right? Who are you working with, and so on. You can use, there are lots of people who you know, they're working from home. They're sort of just independent consultants. And you can look at AmStat, American Statistical Association. So if you want to find, you know, say you're in Pennsylvania or wherever, you can search for statistical consultants in Pennsylvania. You as trainees, I would encourage you to ask about statistical support when you go for faculty interviews, right? And not just because you want statistical support, but it's actually also a good indicator of general infrastructure in general. Like if you get a blank look back, that's a bad sign. What you'd like to hear is, oh yes, we have a whole whole cadre of statisticians, and they're available to answer questions and this and that, right? And it's not unreasonable to make it part of your recruitment package. I want X percentage of a statistician as part of my recruitment package, in the same way that you'd ask for lab space, supplies, staff, so on, right? This is part of that research operation. Questions about this? So actually we're making good headway, so we have lots of time. Sometimes I don't make it to this slide. So I had said that I have this talk and I have another talk, which is the mirror of this talk, right? Which is for statisticians, right? And so this is what I thought it might be interesting if I tell you what advice I give to statisticians, right? So one of the things is to try and quickly figure out the researcher's background. So why is this important? It's because if you're going to be talking about methodological or statistical things to that researcher, you need to kind of peg it how you deliver that at the right level. So I don't want to peg it high and be talking over their head, because A, they're not going to understand what I say, and B, it's going to be off-putting, right? On the other hand, I also don't want to pitch it too low. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to talk down to them, because again, that's going to be off-putting. So one of the things I try to do pretty quickly is figure out how to pitch what I talk to them about, right? And the other thing is to figure out what they want, what their motivation. Let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes people will kind of curbside me, like literally curbside me. Like if I'm walking down the hall, they'll ask me their opinion about, like, how should I do X? Sometimes what has happened is that they've already done whatever they were going to do, and what they really want me to do is to tell them that what they did was okay, right? It took me a little while to figure that out. Sometimes people would ask me, oh, what's the best way to do X? And I would actually put a bunch of time and effort into figuring out the absolute best way. And then after I would deliver that to them, they'd be like, oh, well, I just did a t-test and I was hoping that was okay. And the thing is, that's fine. but I kind of just wish I hadn't spent that time. So I actually try to figure out, do they actually want an answer? Do they just like want to know if what they already did was okay? So that's one thing. I tell people to learn a lot about the data and how it's collected, right? So this usually means going to the person's lab, doing some independent reading. So I work with a group of people that do pain research. I went to their lab and they do something called quantitative sensory testing, where they prick people with needles and they do various things. And I was like, okay, let me see the needle, you know, prick me with it. I let them prick me with it, right? Because I really wanted to understand what they're doing. And so when I get that data that talks about, okay, they pricked the person so many times, I know what that means now. They also do a thing called cold pressor. What that is you put your hand in a vat of cold water and they see how long you hold it there before you pull it out because you can't stand it any longer. So I was like, all right, let me see that vat of water. Like literally understand where the data comes from. Another thing is that I advise them, it used to be in the beginning, like people would say, can I do X? And my response would be like, no, you can't do that. But actually I found people found that really off-putting. And so a better way to sort of deliver that is to provide a workable alternative, right? So it's like, to not so you can't do that, but actually you should do X instead, right? What I do is I do this thing, like I transfer criticisms to unnamed third parties. Like, so this is where actually the slide of reviewer 3 comes in. So like people will sometimes say, well, I want to do X. And what I'm thinking in my head is that's a really bad, stupid thing to do. But I don't say that. What I say is, I think the reviewer won't like it. And that's often a better way to deliver that. So that's like that transferring criticism to the unnamed third party, in this case, like reviewer 3, essentially, right? So I'll say things like, this is awkward, this is not ideal, or something like that. You asked about this, Roger, when will this be done, right? I give people super conservative estimates if I don't know. And also I've found that people, sometimes I just don't know, but people want something concrete. And so I can say, well, you're third in the queue. I have to do this and I have to do this, and then I will get to your project. And that will sort of mollify people. And that's concrete and it's honest, right? I really don't want to say I can get to this on Tuesday when I really can't, right? I want to give people honest, true answers. You know, I don't force a quick decision from people. And then also sort of communication with emotional content should be done in real time and preferably in person. That's another piece of advice. So now in this day of age where everything happens electronically, if you can't go to their office and talk to them, then try and do it face-to-face via Zoom. And so then I think this is my last slide. Is that right? Yeah, that's my last slide. So we have lots of time for questions.
Thank you so much for this really insightful presentation. I have a few questions, but I do want to allow other people to ask questions first. So I'm not too selfish. Any questions for Dr. Leoutsakos? And I guess while I don't see any hands or anything in the chat yet. So while you ponder, I have a burning, I guess, question that's not really a direct question, but maybe an open discussion about. But in one of your earlier slides at the beginning, you had talked about kind of sometimes like I don't know what's the best way to say this, like talking about the research question, the hypotheses between the researcher and the statistician. So I'm trying to look at this from both angles. So I guess on the researcher side, I'm wondering, is it reasonable to have kind of like the statistician try to figure out, like keep your research question and hypotheses because you feel really strongly about that, and have the statistician try to figure out how to best approach it. And then I guess more looking on the statistician side, like so frequently, I work in a medical school as well, and I always get like research questions like the client is asking me, they want to see the relationship between disease X, Y, and Z. And I say, that's not really a clear research question. And I say,
yes, 100%. So yeah, I'll give you a really concrete example. And Sarah worked on this project. So I had someone come to me and say, and this is exactly, you're going to recognize this conversation. I want to look at ADHD and eating disorders and binge eating. I want to look at ADHD and binge eating, right? That was what they said to me. That was their hypothesis. And I said what you just said, which is, that's not a hypothesis, right? Looking at something, that's not science. Science is testing hypotheses. And so I talked to her, and sometimes I'll tell you, sometimes extracting a testable hypothesis from an MD is like, that's like pulling teeth, right? But I don't supply the testable hypothesis. I extract it from them, basically. So in that particular case, we had lots of conversations. Well, what is it exactly that you think you're going to see? Okay, so you think that someone with ADHD is going to be more likely to have binge eating. That's a testable hypothesis, right? Then you have to have a comparison group. You have to have kids who don't have ADHD. Okay, and then also you think there is a relationship between the medications that kids with ADHD are taking and binge eating. Okay, well then you need to have kids with ADHD who aren't taking stimulants. And actually that's very hard to find kids with ADHD who aren't taking stimulants. But if you want to know if it's the meds, you have to have, if you want to know whether it's the ADHD itself or it's the meds, then you've got to have people who don't have ADHD, and then also you need to have people who have ADHD and who aren't taking stimulants. And then you need to think about, okay, well, why aren't they taking stimulants if they have ADHD? Are they different in some other way that's going to be related to the outcome than the kids who have ADHD and are taking? And so that's the conversation that I have with them, and I rely on them to tell me what's in the literature. But that's the extraction, that's the hypothesis extraction process, right? And that can take a long time, and sometimes you have that conversation and you have to kind of send them away to think about it and come back, right? It's absolutely necessary, because I can't make an analytic plan without a testable hypothesis. There's no analytic plan for, I want to look at binge eating and ADHD. I would say to that, okay, well, go look. There's no analysis, right, for that. There is an analysis for, are people with ADHD more likely than people without ADHD to have binge eating, right? So that's a process that you have to engage in. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yes, that does. Yeah, I feel like these discussions sometimes are really kind of like, I think you were kind of hinting at, it sounds like it's kind of like trying to meet them, like kind of clinicians and statisticians are in like two different worlds, and it's kind of trying to meet each other in the middle and try to figure out what's the best way to kind of answer a research question. So I think that really helps. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what you're doing when you do that is that you're providing methodological teaching. So not all clinicians, they're trained to be clinicians. They're trained to treat the patient in front of them. They're not trained necessarily to be scientists. And you can't just be a scientist with no training, right? And so that's training that you're giving them on the job, so to speak. And you should just view it as such.
Yeah. I believe Julie has a question. Maybe just accidentally muted.
I don't have a question. Sorry about that.
Okay, it's okay. Are there any other questions? And it was interesting because like I think before you kind of talked about how it might be a red flag if I believe you said like if the statistician doesn't want to be included as an author. And that happened to me when I was a PhD student. I had a statistician tell me that they didn't want to be a co-author on the paper. And
Yes, you should find out why. Now, I'll tell you, there are situations. There was one example I can think of. The person came and they talked to me for like half an hour and I told them what I thought. And that was my entire involvement. And later on, they sent me the manuscript and had included me as an author. And in that particular situation, I said, you don't have to put me on the paper, because I really felt like that 30-minute conversation wasn't enough. And it wasn't because I had a problem with anything in the paper. I just felt like I would, you know, thank you, but I didn't do enough, right? And so it might be that, which is totally innocuous, or it might be that there's something in there that they don't want their name on it. And if that's the case, then you should at least figure it out what it is, because maybe it's something you want to change, or maybe it's something that you have an honest disagreement about that, okay, you know, they go their way, you go your way, you know, but you probably want to figure out what it is. Especially if they've had a long-term, if they've done a lot of work on that, and then at the end, they don't want their name on it, that's worth figuring out why.
yeah, I guess for me, it was like a faculty member. I had met with him a few times for a paper and I got his advice. And so I mean, we knew how to do the analysis, but he really shaped the research design and everything like that. So I'm like, oh, we're happy to have you as a co-author. And he said no. But he was also a distinguished professor. So I'm like, maybe he doesn't really need this authorship.
Yeah, I think that sounds like more like the first type of case where he just felt like he hadn't done enough. And he was stepping back to allow other people to have more prominence, which is a nice thing, a proper thing to do.
Yeah. I think I saw a hand raised from Jamie, maybe not. I just saw your hand move. No.
Oh, I'm just all over the place. No, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to thank you. This was really, really wonderful to hear, and especially like to hear the both sides. As somebody that's new, I'm a new postdoc, so like kind of learning what's the best way to get kind of set up for success. So this was really wonderful. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes left, so are there any other questions? Oh, I do have another one, but I just want to make sure if there's any other questions.
Oh, there is. I think. Yeah,
Oh.
Gail.
Oh, she's clapping.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just clapping. I was listening to you and processing everything you said, and it was so relevant, everything you talked about. And now I understand more about the work you do. And as a research scientist, I know how to approach questions and sort of understand the world that you live in as a statistician. So thank you so much.
So since we have a couple minutes, I maybe just I have a final question. It's a weird question I was asked on the end, but I was hoping you can talk a little bit more about including the statistician as an author on the paper. Like, so again, it's like, it's weird because I'm trying to see this on both the researcher side and the statistician side. It sounds like it's always not really a debate, like it's fine to include the statistician, or is this sometimes?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that I think that you should follow the guidelines, the published guidelines, the ICMJE, I think, guidelines. They're in a previous slide. That you should follow those guidelines. But I would also say that if your work with a statistician is such that it wouldn't meet those guidelines, then you're probably not including them as a member of your team in a way that would be optimal. And so you should be having those conversations, and you should include them as part of they should be a member of your research team like anybody else, because you're going to learn some things from that person. And also, let's say you're writing a grant, all of those committees have statisticians on them. And so when you have a statistician as part of your team, they're going to be able to anticipate comments that the statistician on the review committee are going to make, right? And so, I mean, that's what I would say. You should use those guidelines, but also if you're using those guidelines and regularly the statistician would not be on that paper, then you're probably not using them effectively. You know, so it's really your loss in a way.
Yeah.
And you're probably going to annoy them.
I think that does make sense. Ethical wise, it's probably best to follow the JHAD-RCMAR guidelines. That makes sense.
And also, when you can point to those guidelines, then you don't have to argue about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You're transferring it to a third party, you know.
Yeah. Are there any other burning questions? Thank you so much, Dr. Leoutsakos. As actually what Jamie mentioned, I was also going to close on this, that I thought this was super helpful to, on the researcher side, to see how to work with the statistician. Also, you touched a little bit briefly, if you're a statistician, how to work with researchers, because I think that kind of communication and work is, collaboration is really essential. So this was super helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and
very happy.
Yeah.
To get to talk.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.